Professor Sekhar Bandyopadhyay begins his lecture. I shall introduce him in a brief way. Professor Sekhar Bandyopadhyay is Emeritus Professor of History, Victoria University, Wellington, New Zealand. He was the founding director of the New Zealand India Research Institute. Educated at Presidency College at University of Calcutta, his primary research interest is in the history of nationalism and caste in colonial and post-colonial India. He is also interested in history of Indian migration and Indian diaspora. He has written 6 books, edited or co-edited 14 books, and published more than 50 book chapters and journal articles. His most recent co-authored book is Caste and Partition in Bengal, the story of Dalit refugees 1946 to 1961, published by QUP 2022 in April 2022. Some of his other books are From Plastic to Partition and After. This is a path-breaking work and has been included in the syllabuses in many universities across the globe. And this book is being published in all the 3 versions, Bengali, English and Hindi. And other books include A History of Modern India, 2nd edition, Orient Lexicon, 2015, Caste, Protest and Identity in Colonial India, Shudras of Bengal, 1847, 2nd edition, Decolonization in South Asia, Meanings of Freedom in Post-Independence in West Bengal, Routledge, Orient Lexicon, 2012, Caste, Culture and Hegemony, Social Dominance in Colonial Bengal, 2004. He has recently co-edited The Lost History of Partition in Bengal, Event, Memory, Representation from Routledge, 2024. Caste in Bengal, Histories of Hierarchy, Exclusion and Resistance, Permanent Black in association with Ashoka University, 2022. Indians and the Antipodes Networks, Boundaries and Circulation, QUP 2018. Religion and Modernity in India, QUP 2016. Calcutta, The Stormy Jackets from Routledge, 2018. Social Science Press, 2015. He has taught in many universities across the world. He has been visiting fellow at the University of Chicago, Australian National University, National University of Singapore, School of Oriental and African Studies, International Institute of Asian Studies, University and Rabindranath University. He is co-editor of the New Zealand Journal of Asian Studies. He is an inaugural fellow of the New Zealand Academy of Humanities and a fellow of the Royal Society of New Zealand. He is a recipient of Rabindra Purushar, Rabindranath Tagore Award given by Bangla Academy, Government of West Bengal, India. He keeps himself busy in teaching, research, papers, guiding students, and attending national and international seminars across the globe. We are very honored that he has spared some time out of his busy schedule for us, and without much ado, I shall now request Professor Sekhar Bandyopadhyay to please begin his talk.
এটাতে মধ্যে রাখা যাবে না হাতে নিয়ে কথা শোনা যাচ্ছে Well, thank you, Oborno, for that introduction. Very generous of you. And thank you, Professor Palit, for inviting me once again to this workshop. শোনা যাচ্ছে না? না, মাইকটা অন করতে হবে বলে নাকি? অন আছে। হ্যালো, ইজ ইট ওকে?
ওই মাইকটা না, ওটা ঠিক আছে, কিন্তু আসলে
হ্যালো হ্যালো,
ওকে, শুনতে পাচ্ছি,
শোনা যাচ্ছে না? ইয়েস, মাইকটা একো করছে। और আমি মাইক ছাড়াই বলছি। আই থিঙ্ক আই উইল বি অডিবল। এতে খুব ইকো করছে, এটা বন্ধ করে কি করে? হ্যাঁ, বন্ধ হয়েছে। Anyway, I'm pleased to be here, and my understanding is that, please correct me if I'm wrong, that all of you are involved in historical research. Is there anyone doing postdoc, or all of you are at doctoral stage? No postdoc. Okay. In fact, when I heard about this workshop, I thought of giving a lecture exactly Historical Research 101, which I say to my PhD students on the very first day of their registration, an opening lecture. So what I'll be doing, I'll make a brief presentation in three parts. That is how the discipline of history has evolved over the time. Secondly, what is the responsibility of the historian? What historian should do, or what historian does? And thirdly, historians have to work in the archives. Archives is the main source of information which historians use. And then I'll discuss how we as historians should use the archives. There can be manifold uses of the archives. We all work at the archives, but there can be many ways of doing archives. When I started research in 1980s, late 70s, 1980s, there was one way of looking at or using archives, and we have come a long way from that. And these days we look at archives in a different way. So, and this change in the way of how we look and use the archives has changed because of the shifts in focus of writing history. The kind of history we were writing and our predecessors were writing, say, professional history writing started in India from around 1950s in a big way. I'm not saying that before that historians were not writing, but major professionalization of historical discipline starts, and university starts, and historical research in a major way starts in the 1950s. And when this early historical writing was being done, it was mainly in a positivist way, what we call today the positivist way. What is the positivist way? Positivist way is to state what actually happened. It's the kind of realistic type of history. We were collecting facts and we were stating the facts as it was happening. In other words, the main focus of history writing was to find out what happened. For a few years or few decades, we were engaged in fact-finding. We were mostly engaged in writing what happened. But then the major shift came. Then we were no longer satisfied by stating what happened. We became more interested in the next question, why it happened. So from the what question, we moved to the why question. And with this move in the presiding question in the mind of the historian was also involved a philosophical change. This philosophical change was that initially we thought that the historical truth is out there somewhere. And the duty of the historian is to retrieve that truth. And that truth which we write is the absolute truth. Many historians of my teacher's generation thought that what I'm writing is the last word. But no historian can write the last word. So initially we began to question this truth claim, that what the historian is writing is not necessarily the absolute truth. One major question, one major kind of intervention is that there is no absolute historical truth is the book, which was called The Past is a Foreign Country. It was written by David Lowenthal in 1985. What Lowenthal is arguing? He is arguing that we visit foreign countries. When we visit foreign countries, we try to know about the culture, about the politics, about the history of the foreign country. We learn the language. But in our short stay, we cannot learn, we cannot know the whole thing. We still remain visitors. Visitors know a little bit of it, but not the whole thing. In order to know the whole thing, you have to live there. But we cannot live in the past. So we, as outsiders, in a temporal sense, try to understand the past by using certain tools. And so, in all honesty, we cannot claim that I know everything about what happened. I know, but that does not mean that I do not know anything. My sources tell me something, and that's something I'm writing. So in other words, the truth claim, the absolutist truth claim of historian came under question. And this also brings in another aspect of historical debate. There is also a common kind of perception that one interpretation of history completely displaces another interpretation of history. You'll often find in books historians claiming everyone who wrote before me were wrong. So what I'm saying is the truth. But that's a false claim. If you had to say that everyone who wrote about this subject were wrong, then you'll have to engage with the evidence that historian offers. And you'll have to argue that all that evidence does not say what this historian has written. So this means, although we accept there is no absolute truth, but we also have to accept there is some truth in every interpretation. So one interpretation can contest, can question another interpretation, but cannot completely displace it. And that is how historical interpretation moves. A new interpretation builds on the older interpretation. We learn from the factual details our earlier historians have found. And on the basis of all those facts, we reinterpret, but that does not mean, that does not really disprove the earlier historian or say that he was completely or she was completely wrong. So this is kind of a false claim. And this is also, in these days, quite evident in the political circles. Now, in the 1950s and the early 1960s, as I said, people believed that historical knowledge was fixed, a knowledge which had to be retrieved through objective scientific method. And as I said, it meant retrieving the past as it actually was. And therefore, and since we were focusing more on facts, this history writing was also more focused on events. We were mainly doing event history. We study revolt of 1857, we study the partition, we study the independence, we study Quit India movement, all these events. But then as we move from the question what to the question why, we start looking at history not as an event, but as a historical process. The event we study does not happen in isolation. The event we study happens in a long historical continuum. Every event had a past and a future. And unless we put that event in this broad temporal and spatial picture, we cannot get into that event. So event becomes history of process. Then comes another shift in the late 1960s, which Carlo Ginzburg has called the Galilean shift, which means history was subjected to the process of mathematics, statistics. So we had all those statistical tables coming into the historical analysis and mathematical formulas by which, by looking at a local event, we could move to generalization. And the other important change that happened, history has always been criticized in the past as being less theoretical. Historians often used common sense to understand historical sequences. Unlike other social scientists like sociologists, anthropologists, political scientists, who have generalized theories. So historians, what they started doing from the 1960s was borrowing these theoretical models from cognate disciplines like sociology, anthropology, political science, economics, etc. So we have the flourishing of social history, anthropohistory, and of course, in a big way in India, economic history, which borrowed theoretical models from the cognate disciplines and applied it to analyze and interpret historical events. One aspect of this scientific approach was that we were looking what we call today as meta-narratives. As I said, it was event history, and by event, we really meant large event, like the revolt of 1857, or Quit India movement, or the nationalist movement in India, etc. And these meta-narratives were also to some extent very certaintist narratives. Certaintist narratives meaning that when the historian used to write, there was no space for ambiguity. The historian would argue in a very straightforward, direct way that I think this is what happened. This was not a possibility I'm talking about. This was certainly what happened, and this is what my evidence says. So these meta-narratives of large aggregates of people like nations, classes, or gender, or these were also very, very fixed or certaintist, and these were mainly influenced by ideological influences like that of Christianity or Marxism or nationalism, and more generally the whole idea of modernity, which kind of influenced our history writing in a very big way from the 1960s onwards. Now, this kind of history writing came under severe criticism in the 1980s. The scientific history is questioned mainly by the marginal minorities. And instead of a certaintist history, they offered the alternative of what is called the perspectival history. History is all about perspectives. Now, what is the problem about what was the problem about this meta-narrative certaintist history? Because in these meta-narratives, you do not find, or you cannot find, the minorities or the marginal people. In the early history of Indian nationalism, you won't find the tribals, you won't find the Dalits, you won't find women. It's all taken over by the broader category of nation. And this is true for all the national histories that were being written, or about class histories, class struggles were being written, because in the histories of class struggle, in the histories of peasant movement, you could not find the individual peasant. Individual peasant is lost in this collectivity. So the individual peasants are presented as a broad collective category. So this historical writing mainly came under criticism and critique from mainly historians who were writing about minorities. And what they were looking for? They were looking for individual. Because what we were writing were collective history. History of movement, national movement, history of class struggle, where we lose the single individual. What an individual was thinking about this whole struggle. This individual is lost in collective history, so the shift started moving back to the individuals. And the second aspect of it is the focus on microhistory. That is, instead of macro history, history of a nation, history of a country, we now start looking at history of a village. We start looking at the history of a family, a single family, and history of a village, or history of a locality, history of a region. So we started moving from nation to region to locality to village, and even further to family. A lot of family histories have been written by professional historians. So in other words, the other shift that happened was the focus on writing microhistory rather than meta-narratives of large collectives like nation or class or so on. And the other change that came was that there was a greater recognition of multiple rationalities. As I said, at the initial stage, modernity kind of determined our vision of history. So different historians began to argue that our nationalism was or our social development was either half-baked modernity or incomplete modernity, or what this whole approach which Dipesh Chakraborty has called that we were trying to approximate the European modernity, and we were lamenting that our modernity is somewhat less than their modernity. But this kind of thinking of being inferior in terms of modernity to Europe, there is a greater acceptance and recognition that there can be multiple rationalities. There can be multiple modernities. European model is not the only model of modernity that has been followed in the world. So our modernity is our modernity. Our modernity is not an imitation of European modernity. It need not be. And then also the other argument that even within a particular nation, even within India, different groups can have different rationalities. A tribal group can have a rationality which is different from an educated middle class rationality. And so what we say, I mean, this is the major argument in Ranajit Guha's elementary aspect, that we have to understand the peasant rebellion in terms of the rationality of the peasant. We cannot expect a modern enlightened middle class rationality and expect that the peasant will always look at the world in terms of material benefits. there are many other factors, social factors, cultural factors, which can determine social action. So in other words, there is a more recognition of multiple rationalities, and from there it's the major shift which happens from the earlier writing of scientific history is that historians began to argue, began to recognize that individual circumstances is important rather than general rules. That is, coming away from the structuralist interpretation of history. That is, the structuralist interpretation of history is that human action is determined by structure. We are all parts of a structure, either class or gender or ethnicity or our specific situation, and everything we do is determined by structure. But the structuralist interpretation is questioned by the counter-argument that individual circumstances can differ. A peasant in a particular situation can behave in a particular way compared with a peasant in another situation roughly comparable. That is, individual circumstances is important in determining people's behavior. So there is a recognition of individual circumstances, individual consciousness, rather than general rules. And therefore, the focus of history shifted to complexities rather than homogeneous aggregates. We do not anymore consider any collectivity as homogeneous. We were dealing with many collectivities, nation, class, caste, gender. But all these collectives are now questioned. That is, none of these collectives are homogeneous. Even members of the same class, even members of the same caste can think differently. So we recognize heterogeneity rather than homogeneity. And from there, the most recent turn is intersectional history, which means that we belong at the same time to different collectives. I am, for example, I'm a male, I'm of Indian origin, I belong to a family, I belong to a village, I belong to a class. It's one historian argues that we have on the wall many hats. And sometimes we take one hat and wear it and behave in that way. And other time that does not mean our other hats are unimportant to us. Sometimes we act as member of a class. Sometimes we act as a member of a nation. Sometimes we act according to our gender affinity. So there are many hats which we wear. And so the focus, as I said, is more on complexity and to see these collectives as more complex than homogeneous whole. The other change that we see in recent years, that the turn from the 1980s onwards was more looking at fragmentation of human behavior and human history. But this has also created another reaction. That is the reaction to look at total history. This came from the French historical school, but this has developed in recent years by historians who belong to what we call the imperial shift. The imperial turn says that we need to look at transnational history. When we look at nationalism in India, for example, or unfolding of empire in India, the British Empire in India was not acting in isolation. So what is also necessary to look at to understand an individual behavior? We need to understand the whole big picture. Otherwise, we do not understand, because The world history has moved, or is actually a history of networks. There are networks of science, and there's networks of, Bruno Latour comes up with this, there are networks of science, networks of commerce, networks of empire, which another historian, Tony Ballantyne, has called webs of empire. There are market networks, which Sanjay Subramaniam has worked on, and the whole global system worked on this circulation of goods, peoples, and ideas. So even if we look at a single village, even if we look at an individual, we cannot understand unless we understand this global network. Every person, knowingly or unknowingly, they were not always conscious of that, knowingly or unknowingly, were part of a global network, and we need to understand the global network in order to understand individual behavior, or in order to understand microhistory. This brought in the most important debate in the 1980s. That is about the supposed objectivity of history. The main question, and this was the major postmodern attack on the discipline of history, that is there anything called an objective history? This was raised by a number of historians like Peter Novak, who is the first major writer who wrote about it. He wrote that, well, we believe that historian needs to be objective, but if you read any book of any historian of repute who is supposed to be objective, you will find that it is actually a very subjective narrative. And other historians like Paul Ricoeur showed that all history, even more structuralist and less narrativist, is constructed according to the same formulas that govern the production of narratives: subservience to historical temporalities, to subjective times. There are moral judgments, and these moral judgments are based on the values of the historian. The historian cannot get out of the value system in which the historian was brought up. So, and even unconsciously, even in your choice of subject that you research, your subjectivity comes in. When you work on peasant movement, you have a special interest in peasant movement. Another person will work on working class movement because that person has a special interest in working class movement. So even in the choice of your subject, your subjectivity comes in. And no historian can be totally objective. So objective history is practically a non-entity. It cannot be there. It's just not there. And from there, the most important attack on the discipline of history came with what is called the linguistic turn, which was mainly headed by one person, literary person, Hayden White. Hayden White wrote about 3 books. One is called Metahistory, the Historical Imagination in 19th Century Europe. Then the other one is Tropics of Discourse, Essays in Cultural Criticism. And the other one, The Content of the Form, Narrative Discourse and Historical Representation. What White argues that what is history? What is historical narrative? When you read a book is, a historical narrative is what he calls emplotment of events. That is, when a historian writes, he uses his judgment to organize his events to tell a story. The micro events which form the broad events are plotted by the historian according to his subjective judgment to tell a story. And that is why the same event can be told and retold by various historians. Simon Sharma wrote a fantastic and landmark book. It's called Dead Certainties. What Simon Sharma does is he looks at one particular murder And he shows that in 3 different sources, that murder has been interpreted in 3 very different ways. So a historian who misses one source will be giving you one kind of story. Or a historian who have seen all the 3 sources will give you another kind of story. So you cannot say that this is what happened and this is what Head and White said, implotment, and this implotment, Head and White goes further, is invented. That is, how you organize your facts to tell your argument or present your story is entirely thought of by the historian, and where his subjective judgment, his value system influences him. And Head and White goes that when a historian writes, he borrows writing models from existing linguistics traditions. That is, a narrative has to be either romance or a tragedy or a comedy or a satire. So we borrow these models and write our stories to fit it to one of these models. Either it's a romance or a tragedy or a comedy or a satire. And this leads to extreme postmodern relativism, which said that there is nothing called a historical truth. And this was a major attack on the historical discipline. But historians have fought back this postmodern attack in the 1990s, and after this huge debate with the postmodernists and the professional historians, what we have come to is what Brian Fay, another very well-known historian, says we have arrived at a dialectical middle ground. Now, what is the dialectical middle ground? That all historians now agree to the constructivist or perspectival nature of historical narratives, which cannot be faithful representations of the past in the narrow empirical sense. Rather, it is representation of the past, but it is not a mirror image of the past. That does not mean that all historical narratives are fictional. Historical narratives can be true in the same way as any other non-fictional discursive text can be true. When a sociologist writes, he also uses the same method to narrate his story or her story. So if the sociologist's narrative can be taken as true, why not the historian's narrative? So in other words, historians cannot claim an absolute truth, but that does not mean that this is untrue. This is all fictional. And one of the major argument is a true interpretation has to be an absolute interpretation is actually a false argument. That is, every interpretation has to have some truth in it, though it is not the whole truth. And the other thing, it comes about ideology and values. Peter Novak argued that objectivity does not mean neutrality. Being objective does not mean you have to be ideologically or value system neutral. For example, when you are talking about slavery in America, you criticize slavery from your current value system. You cannot say that slavery was acceptable in that time, so I should not criticize it. So objectivity is not neutrality or ascetic detachment, but objectivity means comprehensiveness. Objectivity means preparedness to take into account competing narratives or rival interpretations. That is, there can be you have to acknowledge that there can be other interpretations, there can be rival interpretations, and you have to engage in debate with those rival interpretations. So, and that is objectivity. When you look at your evidence, when you look at your hypothesis, you must be aware of the fact that what you hypothesize, is it supported by your evidence? There's a good example you'll find in Ranajit Guha's one of the articles, The Pros of Counterinsurgency. Ranajit Guha, these lines are quite often neglected. What he writes that when someone writes a history of peasant struggle and goes to the documents and find that instead of resistance, some peasants were involved in treachery, they ignored that evidence because they want to present a pure picture of peasant resistance. That's not the historian's craft. That's not objectivity. An objective historian will also have to take into account the counter evidence, the evidence which can question his or her hypothesis, and has to argue with that evidence and have to test that evidence instead of imposing the hypothesis on the evidence, instead of selecting his evidence. That's the historian's craft, and that actually differentiates historical narratives from forgeries and propaganda. And there comes the last part, which I would like to say is about how we use archives, how we interpret our documents. In conventional sense, the archives is the official government archives. I'll come to that later on. And we often think what is written in the official documents is the truth. But every document needs to be treated as text. What does that mean? That every text is written by someone. When you read a report, you should remember that report was written by a particular person, a bureaucrat, a commissioner, or a district magistrate, or a revenue official. And those people are writing with their own biases. So a historian's job is continually critically assess the documents instead of accepting whatever written is truth. I have seen PhD theses where these utterances from official records are taken as truth as they are in government records. And the other important thing about archives, the whole strategy or mechanism of doing research has changed. When I was doing PhD, and many of Professor Pali's students have done the same thing, I believe, we were doing what can be called a serendipitous research. We had a broad subject in mind, and with that subject in mind, we went to archives. And I know one of my teachers told me, go to archives, and the archives will tell you what your research questions should be, and you will find it. And so we did. I initially thought of working on Bhadralok culture and how the Bhadralok were dealing with the caste question, because no work had been done. This was late 1970s, only Hitesh Ranjan Sannal's book had come, which made me aware that this is a topic which can be worked on. And then I went through documents after documents in the archives. In the end, I found there's a whole lot of documents on the Namashudras of Bengal as they were organizing a major social movement. No historian had seen it. But it took me 8 years to finish my thesis. But these days, you cannot afford to spend 8 years to finish your thesis. So what I tell my students is that, and that is accepted all over the world now, that before you go to archives, you do your secondary reading very thoroughly. And from the secondary reading, you formulate your research questions. And this is absolutely necessary. Do not go to archives with a vacant mind. These questions are necessary to find your facts. As I can quote here, another very well-known French historian, Roger Chartier. Roger Chartier says that it's the historians who give voice to the silence of the archives. Archives is silent. It is the historian who gives voice to the silence of the archives. That is, You will get your facts and evidence as you ask your documents the question, as you ask the archives your questions. That is to say, your search for evidence is more focused. And unless it is focused, you spend all your time on reading files after files and you don't get anything. But when you look at those evidences, you keep in mind what H.P. Taylor has said, all sources are autobiographical. As I mentioned already, that you have to critically examine each and every document. But then comes the other point, how you read your documents. And Ranajit Guha has an excellent summary of this. That is, there are two ways to read your documents: reading along the grain, reading against the grain. That is, something is apparently in the text, but there is also what it can be called the subtext, which is hidden in the text. And so you have to read both along the grain as well as against the grain. But even then, if you are particularly working on marginal groups, you will not find answers to your research questions in a conventional archive. That is a government archive where you get only government documents. So conventional archives is still insufficient for working on marginal groups, but still they had history. Gyanendra Pandey has a very important book, the title of the book is called Unarchived History. So how you retrieve the history of these unarchived people who are not mentioned in government documents for various reasons. Women and socially marginal groups, Dalits or Adivasis, where you have to go to non-archival sources, but I won't say call it non-archival sources, but I would say this is an expansion of the idea of archive. Now everything is archive. So you can collect your information through oral history, through ethnography, rumor, myth, folktales, folk songs, experiences. So in other words, in today's world, particularly if you're working on minorities, everything is part of the archives. Archives is not the conventional archives of government documents. Everything you can use as source, but you have to question your source critically. I've seen people using very well-established historians using literature for history, but they take literature as statement of truth. But literature is actually a representation of facts. The novelist looks at the fact and that novelist writes it in his own way. So literature can be used, but literature should not be taken as statement of facts rather than representation of facts. You have to remember that H.P. Taylor version, that every text is autobiographical. It comes from the biases of the writer. And ultimately, as I said, that history writing is more about interpreting your evidence and facts, but any interpretation you have to, as conscious historians, you have to acknowledge that we build on the work of those who worked on this topic before. We can revise them, but we just cannot say that one interpretation displaces another interpretation. We have to be conscious that what we are offering is also our interpretation. That consciousness, that acknowledgement needs to be there in all honest historians. We cannot claim, we cannot have that old kind of absolutist truth claim. I'll end here. I'm happy to take questions. I spoke in English because it is difficult to mix English and Bengali, but I'm happy to take questions in Bangla.
You can ask questions in English or in Bengali, as you please. Please ask a few questions. Don't get such a learned person frequently. So, I welcome. Good question.
যা খুশি হ্যাঁ বলুন
স্যার বলছি গভর্নমেন্টের রেকর্ডগুলো একটা বিষয় আমরা যাচ্ছি তো রেকর্ডগুলো যে পাচ্ছি যারা লিখেছেন আর কি আর সেগুলো তো তাদের মতো করে লিখেছে তো আমি যখন সেটিকে অ্যানালিসিস করবো তো আমার মতো করে অ্যানালিসিস করবো তো
obviously
আমাকে ওদের বক্তব্যটা ওদের তথ্যটাই যে তথ্যটা আমি দিলাম না কোনো স্ট্যাটিস্টিক্স
তথ্যটা দিলেন কিন্তু তাদের বক্তব্যটাকে আপনার মতন করে অ্যানালাইজ করতে হবে হিস্টোরিক্যাল রাইটিং এর মেজর অ্যাসপেক্ট হচ্ছে ক্রিটিক্যালিটি মানে হচ্ছে শুধু ক্রিটিসিজম নয় ক্রিটিক্যালিটি হচ্ছে ক্রিটিক্যাল অ্যাসেসমেন্ট হ্যাঁ যে ডকুমেন্টটা আমি পড়ছি সেই ডকুমেন্টটাকে আমি ফেস ভ্যালুতে নেব না সেই ডকুমেন্টটার ভেতরে কি বক্তব্য কে লিখছেন কেন লিখছেন কি লিখছেন এবং তার লেখার উদ্দেশ্য কি এইগুলো আমাদের মাথায় রাখতে হবে
সাপোজ একটা ঘটনাগুলো ঘটছে
হ্যাঁ
ব্রিটিশরা সাপোজ ফেমিন হয়তো একটা বলছে
হ্যাঁ
ফেমিন আমি যখন রেকর্ডগুলো দেখছি ব্রিটিশরা তারা তাদের মধ্যে করে ইন্টারপ্রিটেশন
হ্যাঁ হ্যাঁ
কিন্তু আমি যখন ওটাকে ব্যাখ্যা করবো তখন ওর পিছনে কি কি কারণ ছিল
এক্স্যাক্টলি
সেটা আমার মতো করে
এক্স্যাক্টলি
আচ্ছা তো
আচ্ছা ওখানে আলো প্লিজ আস্ক ইউর কোয়েশ্চেন প্লিজ গেট আপ
আবিষ্কার করেছিলেন জন মার্শাল তার সঙ্গে রাখালদাস বন্ধ করেছে তার কত 100 বছর পূর্ণ হলো আমরা সবাই জানি রাখালদাস বন্ধ করার ব্রিটিশ রয়্যাল সোসাইটিতে এটা উঠে থাকে ব্রিটিশ মিউজিয়াম কিন্তু আমাদের দেশে জন মার্শালকে প্রকৃত আবিষ্কারকর্তা বলা হয় মানে পেপারস বলছে রাখালদাস বন্দ্যোপাধ্যায় পেপারস কিন্তু ইন্ডিয়া বলছে ভারতবর্ষে সব জায়গায় লেখা আছে সিলেবাস অনুযায়ী প্রত্যেকটা 5 to 11 বই অ্যানসিয়েন্ট হিস্ট্রিতে বলা আছে যে জন মার্শালের সঙ্গে রাখালদাস বন্দ্যোপাধ্যায় দুজনে মিলে হরপ্পান সভ্যতার আবিষ্কারকর্তা স্যার দুজন দুরকম বলছে পেপারস কথা বলছে আর্কাইভসে ব্রিটিশ রয়্যাল সোসাইটি আর ব্রিটিশ মিউজিয়াম লেখা আছে পুরোনো বিবর্ণ হয়ে গেছে এবং সেটা একটা কাগজে প্রকাশিত হয়েছে আনন্দবাজারে রবিবার তাহলে আমরা কোনটা ধরবো আমরা সবাই যদি রাখালদাস বন্দ্যোপাধ্যায় কিন্তু ওখানে বলা হচ্ছে লেখা আছে বড় বড় করে রাখালদাস বন্দ্যোপাধ্যায় কিন্তু এখানে স্যার সিলেবাস কমিটি পাল্টাই সব বইয়ে লেখা আছে ভারতবর্ষের উইথ রাখালদাস বন্দ্যোপাধ্যায়
আমি সিলেবাস কমিটির মধ্যে যাচ্ছি সিলেবাস কমিটিতে তো রাজনৈতিক লোকেরা থাকে আমি বলছি প্রফেশনালি ঐতিহাসিকরা কিভাবে ইতিহাস লিখবেন এর সঙ্গে ইতিহাসের রাজনীতিটাকে আমি টানতে চাই না ইতিহাসের বই এক একটা সরকার আসেন ইতিহাসের বই পাল্টে যায় আবার হয়তো কোনোদিন অন্য সরকার আসবে ওটা পাল্টাবে দ্যাট ইজ কমপ্লিটলি ডিফারেন্ট হিস্ট্রি নিয়ে পলিটিক্সটা আলাদা আমি সেটার মধ্যে যাচ্ছি না আমার মূল এখানে বক্তব্য হচ্ছে যে একজন ঐতিহাসিক যখন ইতিহাস লিখবেন তাকে কি মনে রাখতে হবে তিনি কিভাবে লিখবেন তারপরে ইতিহাস নিয়ে যারা রাজনীতি করেন তারা তাদের মতন করবেন সেটা আমার কিছু করার নেই এবং সেটা আমাদের কারোরই কিছু করার নেই যখন সরকার পাল্টাবে তখন এটা সরকারি ব্যাপার ওই সিলেবাস কমিটি হচ্ছে সরকারি ব্যাপার তার সঙ্গে ঐতিহাসিকদের ইতিহাস লেখার ইতিহাস চর্চার সম্পর্কটা খুবই সামান্য আপনি বলছেন
I'm not actually from the field of history. I'm from English literature, but having interest in the area of partition that I'm considering for my future study from literary perspective because by now I have studied a few literary works, but in the process I realized that without knowing the history particularly, we can't critically represent and analyze the literary works. So as in the introduction you have been mentioned, I would like to pursue Now, in this regard, we have studied a theory, new historicism, where we actually so far traditionally considered that history serves, at least for the stakeholders of literature, that history serves as the background which reflects, not always, which rather reflects the history. As you are saying that literature represents, it does not assert. But new historicism, many of the claims and critics like Stephen Glimbert and others, that history itself is formulated, affected, and constructed by different literary texts. Literature does not mean novel, tragedy, but any text inclusively. So in this regard, when we are approaching partition, should we consider it as something purely from the historical and political perspective of the time, or the writers who wrote from their personal experience about the sufferings of individuals, maybe fictional characters, maybe autobiographical? So should we commingle that political grand narrative or meta-narrative perspective, or should we give it a marginal, oppressive historical approach? If you kindly throw some light on it.
Absolutely. When I said literature as representation, I still stand by that statement, because when someone is writing about her personal experience of partition violence or something, that is her personal experience. And the personal experience can vary from person to person. I have worked with partition literature. I have also worked with oral history of partition refugees, partition victims. Every statement, every narrative varies from one another. And yes, of course, literature constructs history. History affects literature. But my point is, when we look at literature, we look at critically. Not, this criticality is not criticism or rejecting it, but criticality means situating that particular piece of literature within the history which created that literature. For example, in film and history, there's a famous historian called Rosenblum. Rosenblum says that looking at historical distortion in historical films is nonsense. Because when a filmmaker or literary person creates such a work of art, he is not thinking of factual history. He is creating history. He is creating his own narrative of that event. So what a historical film can help us is the period, not when the event happened, but when that particular film was produced. A piece of literature helps us not exactly the period when the event happened, but the period when the literature was being, that particular piece of literature was being written. That is, it is the environment within, the context within which this person was writing. It is constitutive of that period. Partition, for example, our view of partition has changed over the period. So the new historicity kind of argues that literature helps us the period in which that literature is produced. I have worked on the partition literature, the literature that was produced just before the partition or immediately after, mainly before the partition. And how that literature, if you look at the works of, say, Nilesh Bose or Shemunti Ghosh, the two books are very important, I think, where they have looked at the Muslim Bengali literature and looks at and shows how that literature shaped the partition mentality of that period. So that is what the new historicity is. That is the period in which the literature is produced. We understand that period better from that literature. But when someone is writing in retrospect, even autobiographies, even the autobiographies do not reflect the exactly what happened. Because autobiographies are written.
Khushband Singh's Train to Pakistan gives us a fictional version.
Yes. So we have to understand when Khushband Singh was writing. And that explains why Khushband Singh was writing what he wrote. I've seen a number of autobiographies of refugees who came to West Bengal as a result of partition. They're writing in retrospect. And even an autobiography is selective. In autobiographies, people do not mention everything. In oral histories, people refuse to say everything. I have taken oral history interviews of many refugees. I will give you one example. A number of refugees I have said that who came after the 1950 riots in Borishal and everything. And they were harrowing descriptions of violence they faced, and which they narrated. And then we asked, did you face this violence personally? And the answer obviously is no. Obviously, otherwise that person would not be alive. And then we asked how you could escape. And then the answer was, a Muslim neighbor gave us shelter. And this narrative is coming subconsciously. If you ask this person to say consciously, that person chooses to omit that part of the story. But around, if you question around it, subconsciously, those statements come out, which shows that there was still space for understanding, negotiation, settlement, which broke down for various other factors. So, oral history is autobiographical in the cases I'm saying. So what I'm saying is, yes, literature is constitutive of history, but history of the period when that literature is being produced.
কদিন আগে এশিয়াটিক সোসাইটিতে ডক্টর শকুর শেখী ভট্টাচার্যের মৃত্যুবার্ষিকী স্মরণ সন্ধ্যা বলতেছিলেন চিন্ময় বাবু, অধ্যাপক কলকাতা বিশ্ববিদ্যালয়। উনি সাহিত্যের সঙ্গে ইতিহাসের সংযোগ ব্যাখ্যা করছিলেন, অত্যন্ত ভালো করে ভালো বলছিলেন। আমি প্রশ্ন করলাম, স্যার, ইতিহাস নির্ভর উপন্যাস সাহিত্য সম্রাট বঙ্কিমচন্দ্রকে কারণ করে আজ অবধি চলছে। ইতিহাসের তথ্য, সত্য, নিষ্ঠা, অনুসন্ধান এবং পরিশ্রম করে যে তথ্য আমরা পাই, নিউটন নিরপেক্ষ তথ্য, সেগুলো কতটা সংরক্ষিত হয় বঙ্কিমচন্দ্রকে কারণ করে আজ অবধি। উনি বললেন যে এটা তো আমি সাহিত্যের লোক, আমি ইংরেজি সাহিত্যের লোক, এটা আমার এতটা বেশি জানা নেই। তবে ইতিহাসকে নির্ভর করে বহু বহু সাহিত্য আজও রচনা করে যাচ্ছে। তাই ইতিহাস যদি বিকৃত হয়, ইতিহাস বিকৃতি সরে যাচ্ছে প্রায়, পেপারে পড়ি, বইয়ে পড়ি, আমাদের ইতিহাস তো তাহলে তথ্য সংরক্ষিত হচ্ছে না কোনো কোনো জায়গায়।
সেটা হচ্ছেই না, কিন্তু সেই ব্যাপারে আমাদের সতর্ক থাকতে হবে। ব্যাপার হচ্ছে ইতিহাসের সঙ্গে ঐতিহাসিক উপন্যাসের পার্থক্য হচ্ছে, ইতিহাসবিদের একটা কম্পালশন আছে, তাকে প্রত্যেকটা তথ্য দিতে গেলে তার ফুটনোটে তার এভিডেন্স লিখতে হয়। কিন্তু একজন সাহিত্যিক তিনি তার কল্পনার আশ্রয় নিতে পারেন। হ্যাঁ, সেই কল্পনার আশ্রয়ে সে ফ্যাকচুয়াল হিস্ট্রি থেকে ডিভিয়েট করতে পারে। কিন্তু এরও আছে, এরও কি বলে ব্যতিক্রম আছে। সাইমন শামার ফ্রেঞ্চ রেভলিউশন সম্বন্ধে একটা বই আছে, যেখানে তিনি একটা কাল্পনিক চরিত্র ইন্ট্রোডিউস করে দিয়েছেন, যে এই চরিত্রটা যদি থাকতো সে এইভাবে ভাবতো, এইভাবে করতো, এই করতো। তারপরে একদম বইয়ের শেষে উনি বলছেন এই চরিত্রটা আসলে কাল্পনিক। হ্যাঁ, সুতরাং কিন্তু ইতিহাসবিদের কল্পনা ইজ অলওয়েজ বেসড অন এভিডেন্স। historian has no freedom to say anything without any supporting evidence. যেটা যারা সাহিত্য করছেন, যিনি উপন্যাস লিখছেন বা গল্প লিখছেন বা সিনেমা তৈরি করছেন, তাদের সেই বাধ্যবাধকতা নেই। এটাই একমাত্র তফাৎ। কিন্তু ইতিহাসবিদও তার কল্পনা ইউজ করেন। আমরা যে গল্পটা বলি, সেই গল্পটা কতগুলো তথ্য স্বীকার করে সেই তথ্যগুলোকে কিভাবে সাজাবো, সাজিয়ে কি ধরনের গল্প বলবো, সেটা তো আমার উপর নির্ভর করছে। হিস্টোরিক্যাল ইমাজিনেশন একটা বিরাট বড় ব্যাপার। হিস্টোরিক্যাল ইমাজিনেশন না থাকলে হিস্টোরিয়ান হওয়া যায় না। এই ইমাজিনেশন হচ্ছে এই তথ্যগুলো, ছোট 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 তথ্যগুলোকে আমি কিভাবে একটা মালা গাঁথবো, এই মালা গাঁথাটা হচ্ছে হিস্টোরিক্যাল ইমাজিনেশনের কাজ। সেই মালাটা আমি কিভাবে গাঁথবো, কোন রঙের ফুলের পরে কোন রঙের ফুলটা দেব বা দেব না, এই ডিসিশনটা হচ্ছে আমার হিস্টোরিক্যাল ইমাজিনেশন।
ঠিক আছে, রিক্সা আরো বলো। আর কেউ যদি নতুন মুখ বলে ভালো হয়। আর নতুন মুখ কেউ বলবে? If there is anybody from that side who has not spoken earlier, please get up and say something. বলো, দাঁড়িয়ে বলো। হ্যাঁ, দাঁড়িয়ে বলো।
স্যার, আমার একটা কোশ্চেন।
হ্যাঁ, শিওর।
দেখতে পাচ্ছি না।
স্যার, বিষয় হচ্ছে যে আমি এখন সেকেন্ডারি সোর্স যখন পড়ছি, আমি দেখতে পাচ্ছি যে ব্রিটিশরা যখন আমাদেরকে কন্ট্রোল করার চেষ্টা করছে, তো স্ট্রেংথেন দেওয়ার পাওয়ার, আমি দেখতে পাচ্ছি সেই জিনিসটা ব্রিটেনে একটা হয়তো মেথড তারা ইউজ করছে। আমি প্রত্যেকে দেখছি সেই জিনিসটা আমি ইন্ডিয়ার ক্ষেত্রে পাচ্ছি না, কিন্তু সেটা আমি ব্রিটেন বলুন, ইউরোপ বলুন, আমি দেখতে পাচ্ছি। কিন্তু এটা আমি একটা বেস ঠিক বলবো না, কিন্তু ফর শিওর বলা যায় যে সেটা এখানে ইউজ হয়তো হয়েছিল। এবার সাপোজ তার কোনো সোর্স আমি পাচ্ছি না, আর একটা আমি খুঁজেও পাচ্ছি না, বা কোনো সেকেন্ডারি সোর্সও পাচ্ছি না, বাট আমি সেটাকে কম্পেয়ার করতে পারি, যেটা ছোট সোর্সও পাই, দেন আমি সেটা কম্পেয়ার করে একটা স্টাডি হয়তো ক্রিয়েট করতে পারি। তো সেই ক্ষেত্রে যে নতুন একটা ডিসকভার করার কথা বলা হচ্ছে, বা নতুন যে জিনিসটার কথা আমি ভাবছি, আমি যদি উইদাউট কোনো সোর্স পাই, সেটাকে কোনোভাবে কি কন্টিনিউ করা যায়, যেটা ল্যাক বা আমি যে গ্যাপটা পাচ্ছি।
তুমি যেটা পাচ্ছ সেটা তো কোথা থেকে একটা পেয়েছো।
হ্যাঁ, মানে সেটা আমি পাচ্ছি, কিন্তু সেটা ইন্ডিয়া খেতে পাচ্ছি না, অ্যাব্রোডে খেতে পাচ্ছি, সাউথ আফ্রিকা দেখতে পাচ্ছি, ইউরোপে দেখতে পাচ্ছি, বা আমি ব্রিটেনে দেখতে পাচ্ছি। ইভেন যারা সেই জিনিসটাকে সাজেস্ট করছে, তারা সেই সময় কলকাতার কমিশনার ছিলেন, বা সেই সময় তারা খুব পাওয়ারফুল একটা পোস্টে ছিলেন, ঠিক আছে, কিন্তু সেই ক্ষেত্রে তাদের নাম দেখতে পাচ্ছি, বাট ডিরেক্টলি কোনো সোর্স আমি পাচ্ছি না।
তুমি যেটা পেয়েছো সেটাই ব্যবহার করতে পারো।
সেটা তো আমি
হ্যাঁ, সেইভাবেই তোমাকে ব্যবহার করতে হবে। যে সাউথ আফ্রিকাতে যে লোকটি এই কাজটা করেছে, সে এখানে কমিশনার ছিল। এটাই তো হচ্ছে ইম্পেরিয়াল নেটওয়ার্ক। তুমি টনি ভ্যালেন্টাইনের ওয়েবস অফ এম্পায়ার বইটা পড়ো, যেখানে দেখাচ্ছে যে এন্টায়ার এম্পায়ারটা, ব্রিটিশ এম্পায়ার চলতো সার্কুলেশন অফ পিপল, গুডস অ্যান্ড আইডিয়াস। এই গোটা এম্পায়ারের গভর্নেন্সের একটা সেন্ট্রাল আইডিয়া ছিল, এবং সেই সেন্ট্রাল আইডিয়াগুলো এই আইসিএস ইত্যাদি সিভিল সার্ভেন্টরা যারা আসতো, তারা এটাকে করতো, এক্সিকিউট করতো। এবং প্রত্যেকটা ইয়েতেই আইডেন্টিক্যাল পাওয়া যাচ্ছে। তুমি আরেকটু খোঁজো, তোমার যদি সন্দেহ হয় এরকম একটা হয়ে থাকতে পারে, এই লোকটাকে ধরে, যে লোকগুলোকে তুমি পেয়েছো নামগুলো, সেই লোকগুলোকে ধরে আর একটু খুঁজতে থাকো, নিশ্চয়ই পাবে। না পাই, তাহলে তুমি এইভাবে ইউজ করতে পারো যে সাউথ আফ্রিকায় এটা হচ্ছে, সাউথ আফ্রিকায় এটা যদি এই লোকটা করে থাকে, তাহলে কলকাতায় এই লোকটাকে এটা করলো না কেন, বা করেছিল কিনা, এই প্রশ্নটা তোলা যেতে পারে। এটা তুমি প্রশ্ন হিসেবে তুলতে পারো। হ্যাঁ, হ্যাঁ, নিশ্চয়ই পারো। তুমি প্রশ্ন হিসেবে তুলতে পারো এবং বলতে পারো আমি কোনো ডিরেক্ট এভিডেন্স পাইনি, বাট দিস ইজ এ পসিবিলিটি দ্যাট কুড হ্যাভ হ্যাপেন্ড। এইভাবে তুমি বলতেই পারো।
কি বলবে এবার? তোমাদের ইচ্ছে বলছি, কেউ বলবে? হ্যাঁ, তুমি বলছো, আর কেউ বলবে? তোমাদের দু একজন কেউ বলবে কিছু? তুমি যে এতগুলো প্রশ্ন তুললেন, হ্যাঁ, তো এদিক থেকে actually এলে ভালো, এটা হচ্ছে তিন চারজন বলেছে।
How do we analyze or interpret or look at, like, with a pinch of salt, to any evidences from oral history? For example, if the oral historical evidence is, we're taking it from people from marginalized communities, for whom, as I said, there are no documents or evidences in the conventional archives. So there is no other evidence that I can corroborate these oral historical evidences with. So in that case, how do we move forward in order to?
You just state what you stated. That this is an oral evidence
Right.
for which there is no other documentary evidence. And we should remember that. So this is this person's perception. You can present it in that way. The main point is you have to be honest about your evidence. Do not claim anything which is not in the evidence. If you do not get evidence, but you have a hunch, you state that this is a possibility, but there is no direct evidence for that. And if in oral history you find any statement for which you do not get corroboration in documentary evidence, you state that I did not get any corroboration in documentary evidence, but this is the oral evidence of a person who was involved in whatever way. I'll give you a concrete example. I use this. I was given a document by an important person about his father, who was an important political leader. But I could not verify its authenticity. So I just wrote that. I received a document from this person about his father, although I did not get any document, it did not get any evidence to verify the authenticity, but this document says this. So what it offers is the reader is the possibility, but not the certainty. The reader will not take it as a certain that this must have happened. The reader gets an indication of a possibility, but not the certainty of a fact.
So I can state it as like.
Yes, as said by this person. And say that I haven't received any documentary evidence to any other documentary evidence. So, but this is what he said.
Thank you, sir.
Okay, if anybody has any more questions before you wind up, বলো।
আমাদের সঙ্গে যদি একটু বলে দেখেন, আপনি তো পার্টিশন ভাইওট নিয়ে এত রেকর্ড দেখেছেন, এত সোর্স দেখেছেন, তো আপনি একটা যদি এক্সাম্পল আমাদেরকে দেবেন যে একটা গভর্নমেন্ট সোর্স বা রেকর্ড থেকে আপনি কিভাবে এক্সপ্লেন করেছেন বা কিভাবে ব্যাখ্যা করেছেন আমাদের যদি একটা এক্সাম্পল দেন তো আমরা একটু বুঝতে পারবো স্যার। যে কোনো একটা গভর্নমেন্ট আমরা রেকর্ড সেটা আপনি কিভাবে অ্যানালাইসিস করেছেন করবো কি কি দিক
ইমিডিয়েটলি আমার একটা এক্ষুনি যেটা অফেন্ড মনে পড়ছে, আমি পার্টিশন নিয়ে রেফিউজি প্রবলেম নিয়ে পুলিশ রেকর্ডস দেখেছি। তাতে একটা পুলিশ রেকর্ডে আমি দেখেছি যে যোগেন্দ্রনাথ মন্ডল সম্বন্ধে বলা হচ্ছে যে তিনি বলেছেন যে এই সমস্ত রেফিউজিদের দণ্ডকারণ্যে পাঠিয়ে দেওয়া হচ্ছে, তার কারণ একটা ষড়যন্ত্র চলছে পশ্চিমবঙ্গকে শিডিউল কাস্ট মুক্ত করার জন্য। That's the only reference I got. এবং যোগেন্দ্রনাথ মন্ডল সম্বন্ধে নানা রকম মন্তব্য আছে। তাতে আমি যেটাকে ইউজ করেছি যে there is only one police record, যে রেকর্ডটার ভিত্তিতে আমি বলতে পারি না অ্যাজ এ হিস্টোরিয়ান যে উনি এই ধরনের কোনো কথা ভাবছিলেন। কারণ পুলিশ রেকর্ডে পলিটিক্যাল নেতাদের সম্বন্ধে, বিশেষ করে যারা অপোজিশন পলিটিক্যাল লিডার, তাদের সম্বন্ধে অনেক রকম খারাপ খারাপ লেখা আমি আগেও দেখেছি। সুতরাং আমি এই একটা রিপোর্টের ভিত্তিতে আমি এটা ক্লেম করতে পারি না, কিন্তু আমি এটা মেনশন করতে চাই যে এরকম একটা রিপোর্ট আছে।
স্যার, লালবাজারে একটা মিউজিয়াম আছে, এখনো আছে।
হ্যাঁ, জানি।
তা সেখানে অনেক সময় বিপ্লবীরা যে মারা গিয়েছিল বা তাদের পুলিশ এনকাউন্টারে মেরে দেওয়া হয়েছিল বা হত্যা হয়েছিল, এই সমাজে অনেক তথ্য, যেমন নদিয়াতে খাদ্য আন্দোলন, একটা বিরাট আন্দোলন, খাদ্য আন্দোলনের এফেক্ট পড়েছিল, রেশন বন্ধ হয়ে গেছিল, সরকার খুব বিব্রত ছিল, মানুষ খেতে